The morning, the smoke billowed into the pale horizon. I felt something ancient stir in me, an instinct older than law, older than civility. I'd woken before dawn to tend the corn barn, a heartbeat of my modest property on the edge of a gated community that never truly accepted me. To them, I was a curiosity, a federal judge living like a farmer, refusing their polished lawns and ornamental shrubs. To me, the barn was more than lumber and corrugated metal. It was a sanctuary of sweat and history, a place where the corn I harvested reminded me of my father's voice and my mother's patience. But when I stepped outside, the smell of gasoline had already cut through the morning air like an accusation. The barn's silhouette glowed red, flames licking skyward, daring me to stop them. I didn't shout. I didn't panic. I simply walked closer, listening to the crackling timbers as if they were testifying under oath. This wasn't an accident. My mind cataloged every detail like evidence. The lock had been cut clean, the accelerant poured deliberately. This was arson. And I already suspected the culprit, the woman the neighborhood called Karen. Her real name was Lorna Kensington, the self-proclaimed enforcer of the Homeowners Association. She'd knocked on my door dozens of times, lecturing me about aesthetic violations, about how my cornfield and my barn weren't in keeping with the uniform charm of the cul-de-sac. I had dismissed her politely, then firmly, then with silence. But people like her did not tolerate silence. People like her mistook it for weakness. I called the fire department, though I knew they'd be too late to save the structure. As I watched the flames devour years of labor, my pulse slowed into the calm rhythm I only felt in court. I had presided over cases involving men who thought they were untouchable. Corporations that treated fines like pocket change, and syndicates that used intimidation as currency. I knew how to look into the eyes of power-drunk people and see the cowardice beneath. That same cowardice had now taken the shape of suburban tyranny in yoga pants. Karen had overstepped. She thought I was just another neighbor to bully into compliance. She had no idea that my chambers stretched far beyond the reach of her HOA charter. When the firefighters arrived, I gave them space, answering their questions with clipped precision. They hinted at a domestic dispute or youth vandalism, but I shook my head. This wasn't random, I said, my voice steady. One of them asked how I could be so sure. I met his eyes and said, because I know who did it. He didn't press further, perhaps sensing that my certainty wasn't bravado. It was judicial instinct, the kind honed by years of weighing lies against truth. By midday, the barn had collapsed into a heap of charred beams. I stood in the ash, the soles of my boots smoldering. Neighbors gathered behind their manicured hedges, whispering. Some feigned sympathy. Others wore the smug expressions of people who believed justice was ornamental. Karen herself emerged from her pristine porch, wearing a robe and sipping coffee like a queen surveying conquered land. She caught my eye and tilted her head in mock pity. It's such a shame, she said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. But maybe now you'll consider landscaping more. Appropriately. I didn't answer. Words at that moment would have been wasted currency. Instead, I memorized the cadence of her voice, the smug tilt of her smile. In court, I often said nothing until it mattered most. The silence unsettled her. She shifted, expecting rage, perhaps a shouted threat. Instead, I gave her nothing. Her smirk faltered. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at my oak desk, surrounded by case files, but I wasn't reading them. I was writing. Not legal opinions, not rulings, but notes, chronologies of harassment. Dates of HOA notices, verbatim quotes of her petty threats. I compiled a dossier on Karen Kensington as if she were a defendant in the highest court of my jurisdiction. Because in a way, she already was. The truth was, I had kept my identity from most of my neighbors. They knew I was Judge Daniels, but they thought it meant small claims or traffic disputes. They had no inkling that I was a federal judge with jurisdiction over racketeering, corruption, and organized crime. My courtroom was feared because I demanded honesty, because I stripped away facades until only truth remained. And if Karen thought her HOA charter gave her unchecked power, she was about to learn what real authority looked like. The next morning, I called an investigator I trusted, a former U.S. Marshal, who owed me more than a favor. I explained the situation in the plainest terms. He didn't laugh, didn't mock the absurdity of a judge asking for help with a burned barn. He understood. Petty tyranny grows into real tyranny if unchecked. He promised to dig discreetly, to pull security footage from the neighborhood gates, to interview the groundskeepers who often saw more than they reported. Days passed, and the whispers grew louder. Karen strutted through the neighborhood like a victor, convinced she had silenced me. But my silence was strategic. Each time she passed, I noted her arrogance, her brazenness. It reminded me of defendants who smirked on the first day of trial, only to crumble when the evidence was laid bare. Then the call came. My investigator had secured footage, a grainy image of Karen at 2 a.m., carrying a red gas can toward my barn. It was enough. Not enough for a jury yet, but enough for me. I held the printout in my hands, the flames from the barn reflected in her guilty posture. I had a choice. I could press charges immediately, bring the law down upon her like a hammer. Or I could wait. Let her arrogance deepen. Let her believe she was untouchable. And then reveal my hand when the weight of her own lies crushed her. I chose patience. After all, I had spent years teaching the arrogant the same lesson. The higher they climbed, the farther they had to fall. So I attended the next HOA meeting. I wore a plain jacket, no robe, no gavel. Karen presided at the front like a monarch, scolding residents about mailbox paint and flower arrangements. When she finally turned her attention to me, the room hushed. "Judge Daniels," she said with a mocking lilt, "we're so sorry about your little incident. But perhaps now you'll see the importance of following community guidelines." I rose slowly, deliberately. The room held its breath. For the first time, I let my voice carry the authority it always carried in court. "Ms. Kensington," I said, "you've committed arson. I have the footage. And you've also committed something far worse. You've underestimated who I am." The silence that followed was not mere shock, it was fear. Even Karen, for once, couldn't summon a retort. That was only the beginning. Karen's silence at the HOA meeting was sweeter than any verdict I had ever delivered. It was the silence of a predator realizing she had mistaken prey for another beast entirely. But silence alone was not enough. Justice is never satisfied with intimidation. It demands reckoning. I left that meeting without raising my voice further, without brandishing evidence, without threatening charges. Instead, I let her stew in the knowledge that I had spoken the truth, and the truth was an iron chain she could not wriggle free from. The next day, the whispers became a roar. Neighbors who had once cowered before her self-pointed authority now looked at her with suspicion. They gathered in clusters, their words like arrows she couldn't dodge. Arson. Footage. Federal judge. The power dynamic shifted overnight. She could feel it slipping through her manicured fingers. But Karen was not the type to retreat gracefully. No, she doubled down. She went door to door, spinning a tale of how I had fabricated evidence, how I was abusing my position. She painted herself as the victim of a tyrannical judge who sought to ruin her life over a misunderstanding. Her lies might have swayed a weaker neighborhood, but the timing was against her. My investigator's quiet work had borne fruit. The footage was now sharpened, the timestamp enhanced. The fire marshal's report corroborated the use of accelerant, matching the exact brand Karen had purchased only days before. And then came the crowning jewel, a witness. A maintenance worker had seen her dragging the gas can across the pavement. Muttering about teaching that stubborn judge a lesson, it was over. All that remained was how I would proceed. I could have called the police immediately, handed over the evidence, and watched the legal machine grind her down. But there was something poetic in restraint. I wanted her to feel the walls close in, not from sirens, but from inevitability. And so, I gave her rope. At the next HOA meeting, barely a week later, I brought copies of the fire marshal's report. I didn't wave them in her face. I slid them onto the table for every board member to read. Murmurs spread as the words accelerant and intentional ignition passed from hand to hand. Karen's face blanched, her composure cracking like old porcelain. "You can't prove anything," she spat finally. her voice quivering beneath the brittle shell of confidence. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table the same way I did in my courtroom before delivering a final ruling. You misunderstand me, Miss Kensington. I don't need to prove anything here. This isn't a courtroom. But if I decide to move this into one, you won't be facing me as a neighbor. You'll be facing me as the system itself that broke her. She stumbled through some incoherent tirade about witch hunts and freedom, but her words carried no weight. The neighbors, once her subjects, now looked at her with thinly veiled contempt. They weren't afraid of her anymore, and without fear she had nothing. Still, justice demanded more than humiliation. The barn was gone, reduced to ashes and insurance paperwork. My land bore the scar of her malice, and though I held the power to prosecute, I also held something else: discretion. In my years on the bench, I had learned that justice was not always about punishment. It was about transformation. If I threw her to the courts, she would hide behind lawyers, spin narratives, perhaps escape with probation and a fine. But if I handled this carefully, she might actually learn. So I summoned her. Not with a subpoena, not with handcuffs, but with a letter slipped beneath her door. A single line written in my hand: "Come to my property tomorrow at dawn. We will discuss the terms of your future." She came. Of course she did. Power may strut in daylight, but it obeys in the quiet hours when conscience gnaws. She arrived wearing defiance like armor, but her eyes betrayed the tremor beneath. I stood by the remains of the barn, the smell of charred wood still sharp in the air. "You destroyed something my family built," I said evenly. "Not just wood and nails, memories, heritage, work. And you did it because you thought your rules were above my rights." She opened her mouth to retort, but I raised a hand, silencing her as I would silence a bickering attorney. "You are guilty, Miss Kensington. I could end your life as you know it with a single motion to the U.S. Attorney. You would face federal charges. Your name dragged through courts, your reputation obliterated." I let the words hang like a blade. "But I am offering you an alternative." Her voice cracked when she asked, "What?" "What alternative?" I gestured to the blackened rubble. "You will rebuild this barn? Not with contractors. Not with HOA funds. With your own hands? You will sweat. You will labor. You will learn what it means to create instead of destroy. And when it stands again, stronger than before, only then will I consider the matter closed." Her jaw dropped. "Manual labor? You can't be serious." "I am more serious than you've ever been in your life," I said, my voice cutting like a gavel. "This is your sentence. Refuse, and I go to the prosecutors. Accept, and you may yet find redemption, for the first time." She looked Smallknot, the queen of cul-de-sacs, not the tyrant of flower beds, but a frightened woman realizing the cost of her arrogance. And after a long silence, she whispered, "I'll do it." So began the strangest arrangement of my career. Each morning, Karen arrived at my property in old clothes, blisters on her hands, sweat streaking her makeup-free face. At first she complained bitterly, muttering curses under her breath. But as the days stretched into weeks, something shifted. She learned how to hammer without splitting the wood, how to lift beams with steadiness instead of fury. She began asking questions instead of sneering. And though she would never admit it aloud, I saw something soften in her, the faintest trace of humility. The neighbors watched in stunned silence as their former tormentor labored in plain sight. The symbolism was not lost on them, the enforcer now serving the judged. The tyrant humbled beneath the weight of her own crime. And as the frame of the new barn rose, so too did the whispers of respect. Not for Karen, for the law she had finally encountered. Months later, the barn stood complete. Stronger, taller, its beams aligned with precision born of sweat and repentance. On the final day, Karen stood before it, her hands raw, her clothes streaked with dust. She looked at me not with defiance, but with something close to reverence. "I never understood," she said quietly, "what it meant to build. I only knew how to control, to tear down." I was wrong. I nodded. That is what justice is meant to teach. Not destruction. Not fear. Understanding. She left that day a changed woman. She resigned from the HOA within the week, her iron grip dissolved. The neighborhood, once fractured by her tyranny, found balance again. And though no court record bore her name, no jury heard her confession. Justice had been served in its purest form. As for me, I stood in my new barn at dusk, the golden light streaming through the slats, and felt the weight of both loss and restoration. The law had not needed to flex its harshest muscles. The robe had stayed folded, the gavel unraised. Yet power had been exercised in the most profound way, through restraint. And somewhere in the quiet, I imagined my father's voice, my mother's patience, whispering that this balance between mercy and authority was why I had been entrusted with the title of judge. Karen had burned my barn, yes. But in doing so, she had ignited something else. A reminder that even the feared must choose carefully when to wield fear and when to wield grace.